On the 23rd of May 1994, 45-year-old Pamela Lawrence was brutally beaten and left for dead on the floor of her jewellery shop in Glyde Street, Mosman Park. The attack appeared to be that of a frenzied assault, with excessive number of injuries to the head. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to have been stolen, making robbery an unlikely motive. The brutal nature of the murder sent shockwaves throughout the community, and local police found themselves under immediate pressure to solve the case. With the victim seeming to have no apparent enemies, detectives interviewed over 130 people of interest who were in and around the area on the night of the murder. Andrew Mallard was one of those people.
Right, Andrew, videotape is now operating, right? And I'm formally advising you that you're formally being recorded on videotape. Do you understand that?
Yeah, I understand that.
Right. My name is Detective Sergeant Capone, and this is Detective Emmett. For the purpose of the interview, can you give us your full name, please?
My name is Andrew Mallard.
Now, for the purpose of the interview, can you indicate to us where you said you hit her on the head?
I think the initial blow would have been around here on the forehead, and as she went down, it hit on the cranium, and then as she went down again on the temple and just sort of mashed the fuck out of her until there was blood and hair and brain.
Yeah, righto. Okay, mate.
May I say something else?
Okay, go on.
Initially, this person entered the room thinking that he was on his own, but then he heard the sound of someone rustling in the front, and that would have been Pamela bending over the counter, putting her jewellery away, thinking that she would...
Right. We're just going a bit further from that.
But I've got some more ideas on that.
Let's just go through what you told us first, Andrew, okay?
Right.
Okay. The fact is, you've told us all these things. Now you say it's all a complete pack of lies.
I'd say that that was my version, my conjecture of the scene of the crime.
Okay. We'll have to leave it at that. End of story.
This is difficult for me to talk about, particularly trying to put it together in a context for people to understand, because so much happened and it's so complicated. To try and explain it succinctly isn't an easy thing, particularly when I still suffer mild trauma when I have to talk about it. I came from a very good family. I came from a family that was very supportive and very loving. My father was an ex-military man. He was 22 years in the British Army, and I was extremely proud of my father. I had always aspired to be like my father, so when I was a teenager I decided to join the army, but that was a wrong move for me. I'm not an aggressive man. In fact, I'm quite a sensitive person, and the army was too rough for me and too violent. It's something I'm not. As a young boy, I was often bullied because I was a shy, sensitive type person. It kind of built my persona as somebody who started having issues of self-esteem, which led to behavioural problems later in life. At the time the Mosman Park murder happened, I was homeless in Fremantle. I tried to survive on the streets on my own and was determined to move through this and cope. I sold my watch and my jewellery that I had worn at the time, and I was actually out of all resources, so then I would just resort to petty theft to provide myself with money for food and unfortunately for marijuana also. I was then eventually befriended by a person who lived in Mosman Park, which brought me into the vicinity of the horrendous murder. Trying to impress the person that I was living with, who was female, I went to her ex-boyfriend's place where she had told me that he had owed her money and I had stolen things from this person's place. And that brought me to the attention of the homicide police, which then led to my wrongful arrest. I was sitting one morning at Gino's Cafe, and all of a sudden a car reached to a halt just in front of me. Doors flew open and these guys wearing suits come dashing across the road to me, hauled me out of my seat and dragged me across the road, threw me over the bonnet of the car, handcuffed me, violently shoved me into the back seat. The detective sat in either side of the back seat. Then my head was violently pushed down between my knees, and the next thing I hear is the cocking of a weapon, which I recognise from the time I had done in the army, and a pistol was shoved into my face.
2 weeks after Pamela Lawrence's murder, police brought Andrew Mallard in for questioning. Unsatisfied with his alibi for the night of the murder, detectives interviewed Andrew several more times, totalling over 12 hours of unsigned, unrecorded interviews. It's been alleged that during these interviews, Andrew was stripped naked and assaulted numerous times by detectives.
I had no idea what was happening. I was led to believe that I was being interviewed to help with inquiries because I was living in the area. I thought it was just routine. And then it became clear to me that they were looking at me as a suspect rather than a line of inquiry to help. And that became clear when Detective Capehorn produced a Polaroid of what appeared to be a body laying face down. I distinctly remember a big area of blood on the back of the hair, and I found it quite disturbing, and I actually couldn't look at it. Then it became clear to me what was going on, and I repeatedly stated my innocence. Prior to the second interview, there was a week that I was released, which I subsequently know was a deliberate tactic by police. I had become into contact with this undercover police officer that police had organised during this week where they were determined to set me up. He supplied me with marijuana, good quality marijuana, and a smoking implement in the form of a bong.
In 1994, when the interviews took place, it was illegal for detectives to take down statements in their notepads and have their unsigned contents admitted into court. By the time of the trial in 1995, a law had been passed maintaining that these statements were unsafe and could not be relied upon. However, as the legislation had not been ratified by the governor, the detective statements were allowed into court, virtually unchallenged. Although there was absolutely no forensic evidence linking Andrew to the crime scene, he was convicted of willful murder and sentenced to 30 years in Casuarina maximum security prison. Andrew's conviction was based solely on the evidence of the police, a fact which was highly conceded by the prosecution.
During the police interviews with Andrew, they kept asking him things like, well, what would the murderer have done? Can you give us your theories? And so Andrew started giving them his theories, and the policeman asked him, well, what do you think the murderer would have used as a murder weapon? And Andrew thought, well, she's a jeweller, she'd have a tool shed out the back. Probably the murderer grabbed a spanner from the tool shed and he would have hit her with that. They then said, Andrew, can you please draw this spanner? And Andrew's very artistic, so he draws this beautiful Sidchrome spanner, even writes Sidchrome on it. And next thing you know, the prosecutor in court is holding up this drawing saying, this is the murder weapon, this is the murder weapon, this is the weapon that Andrew used to bludgeon poor Mrs. Lawrence to death. All the while, he knew that the police had done tests after Andrew talked about this weapon. They went and got the state pathologist to do some tests on, to see whether this weapon, this spanner, could have produced the same wounds on Mrs. Lawrence's head. Well, turns out the spanner could not have reproduced those wounds on Mrs. Lawrence, or produced them on Mrs. Lawrence, so the spanner was obviously not the murder weapon. The prosecutor knew that, and still he holds this thing up in court on day one and said, this is the murder weapon that Andrew used to kill Mrs. Lawrence.
As Andrew's appeal lawyers uncovered additional evidence which had been withheld from Andrew's defence and not presented at trial, Andrew's legal team approached Labor MP John Quigley.
I can recall that it was the start of Lent 2002, a season when we Catholic boys are urged to give up something for Lent and think about our lives, and it was during that, because I was living by myself, and it was during that period of time that I gave up going out and stayed home by myself for 6 weeks to study this case, because it was massive. By Easter of course, the end of Lent, by Easter, I had come to the view that Andrew was innocent, that his conviction, which had been challenged as far as the High Court of Australia and thrown out, his appeals had been thrown out, I came to view that to secure his conviction and to hold this against scrutiny by the High Court would have involved massive police corruption. Difficulty with a case like this, having acted for the police for 25 or 30 years, is that I know that they will go to no ends. There'll be nothing they won't do to cover their tracks. Having come across this chalice of poison, I didn't want to put my hand in it or drink from it because I knew these coppers would go for my guts.
My first night in prison was horrific. By the time the court had finished, it was like late afternoon when I was wrongfully found guilty, and it wasn't until I think 6, 7 o'clock at night that the prison transport came to pick me up. And so I eventually came to the prison when everything was already in a state of lockdown. I was led inside the prison and then led through the prison compound into a darkened cell, which was very bare and dirty and smelly, with a very thin mattress and the barest of blankets. And I just lay on my bed and just tried to make sense of it. I was trying to work out what was going on. I just couldn't understand what was happening to me. A typical day in prison is lockdown at 6 o'clock at night and then unlock at 7 o'clock in the morning. And you're locked away at 6 o'clock again, and then the next day is the same. Prison life is very harrowing, very, very tough. I can only describe it as being like a schoolyard. Literally, a lot of immature people who are bullies, and you have this pecking order going on. As far as violence was concerned against me, there were prisoners in there that were really psychotic killers and were pretty psychopathic, violent types. In prison I discovered Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, as well as meditation and yoga, which kept my mind focused and my body fit. I would try and vary my routine in things that I did, so I would either be reading, studying, exercising with yoga, practicing meditation and Buddhist philosophy. I would try to vary things to keep my sanity. For instance, when prisoners would be walking around the exercise yard, I would walk the other way. I was deliberately determined not to become institutionalised, and I thought I had beaten that by referring to prison officers as prison officers and Mr. So-and-so, if I knew their names, where other prisoners would call them boss. There was this regime of, or this thinking of us and them, and you call a prison officer boss, and you know, as far as I was concerned, I was the boss of me, and that was that.
I mean to say he had been totally institutionalised. He was non-compliant to the officers in the sense that he would never admit that he was a murderer, so he'd never go on an anger management program or a violence management program because he said he wasn't the murderer, which in turn had consequences for him because electing not to go on the anger management or violent offenders program meant he would never be considered for parole because he'd never repented or tried to become the new non-murdering Andrew. He just stood fast, I wasn't the murderer. So he would never move to a new or more comfortable cell when offered after 5 years. As people go through the institution, they get better accommodation. He would never accept that because he felt to do that would be acquiescing in this unjust imprisonment and somehow shaking hands with those who are unlawfully imprisoning him.
Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his power. Put on the whole armour of God so that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, and against the powers of this present darkness. Andrew and I would meet usually once a week when I went in there. The first impression I had of Andrew was of a rather gaunt, tall, desperately unhappy man who was distracted to a point of just not being able to relax, terribly tense about everything that went on around him, and very much avoiding contact with pretty much everyone in the prison.
I think the Mallard case is probably one of the saddest indictments on the WA justice system I've come across. And it's not just the police and the prosecution, but it's the judiciary. When Andrew was granted an appeal, his second appeal, because it was discovered evidence had been held back by the police, the appeal went for something like 26 hearing days, which is unheard of. It's very long. Normally appeals are heard in 1 or 2 days, 3 at the most. So the judges got to hear everything, and it was very well presented by Malcolm McCusker QC and his team. And all 3 judges at the end of it went. And I walked out of that court and I thought, I must be the biggest idiot on the planet. I've just seen a gross case of injustice against this guy that should have led to a retrial, and all 3 judges say no.
We had a person who was mentally infirm, certainly not insane, mentally infirm, who had been picked upon by a group of very powerful, very dishonest police officers, and who had been thrown in jail for the rest of his life, and lazy old judges, barely with enough energy to lift their fountain pen to write the sentence, life imprisonment, frail old judges, too lazy to properly scrutinise what the police were about. And so I said to Andrew, I held him in my arms actually in prison because no one else could get in there. And he was very, very scared at that time. He was 10 years into his 25 or 30 years that he had to do. So he was very frail at that point. So I held him in my arms and promised him that no matter how long this took, no matter where it took me, I would never ever leave his side. Ever. And that he asked me whether he'd get out. I said, well, only if we got this case back over to the High Court in Canberra, because although we'd have to first appeal to Western Australian judges, there would be no Western Australian court that would overturn his conviction, because the consequences of doing so would be to identify the whole system as corrupt. And no Western Australian judge would have the balls to say that, because Perth is too anal and the tentacles of the system just get tangled around your throat, and as you tear one corrupt tentacle off, another one slithers around you. You've just got no chance.
9, 10, eyes open. In my professional opinion, what has just been observed here, the classic hypnotic phenomena of no bleeding from a needle, no pain felt, and lots of rapid eye movement from the start of the session all the way through to continuation, and a correct version of arm levitation.
Hypnosis is a very misunderstood process, although scientifically proven to exist. There's many different styles and types of hypnosis. The hypnosis that I used with Andrew to do his regression is a progressive muscle relaxation and confusion technique. I was given an envelope that was sealed, and it was opened in front of a video camera, and it had questions that Andrew's defence team had put down in writing, and I would read them out, and then I would ask the questions such as,
Did you kill Pamela Lawrence?
No.
Did you hit Pamela Lawrence?
No.
Did you assault Pamela Lawrence?
No.
and then at the end of it, before I brought Andrew out, I had to stick a needle through his arm, so you could see that there was a genuine non-sensation through the body. Now, the answers that we got from Andrew 10 years after the event, or 8 years at that time, were 95% congruent with what he had told police in statements, which is the human memory is not that good in a normal conscious state.
It wasn't until later in my imprisonment, when I had overcome the trauma, I decided that I needed to focus on preparing myself for my eventual release. I never believed that I would be incarcerated for the rest of my life, simply because I was innocent. So I set about using the time as best as constructively and as best as I possibly could, by focusing on what I would really like to do in my life. Now I have the opportunity to look at myself and to really understand what I was really good at doing, and that was art. Art for me was a respite from the tumult and the craziness of my wrongful imprisonment and the scariness of it all. And so art was an escape for me. It's almost like a meditative practice. I'm very much interested in the body and figurative work in conveying harmony between man and woman of a non-sexual content, but something that is imbued with an essence of harmony. I guess my painting and my art stems from a desire in prison to have a wife and a family of my own, and to have a harmonious relationship.
In October 2004, Andrew Mallard's legal team were granted special leave to appeal to the High Court of Australia, and in September 2005, Andrew's appeal was finally heard.
We got to the High Court, and I knew it was all over in the first hour when Mr. Justice Callanan turned to Malcolm McCusker QC, who was leading for Andrew. I'm sorry, turned to Brett Walker SC, the Sydney Queen's Council, the local DPP had hired to try and save his bacon, turned to Mr. Walker and said, but Mr. Walker, just the non-disclosure, just them keeping secret that the wrench couldn't have murdered Mrs. Lawrence, that's enough to order a new trial, isn't it? Just that alone. So I was able to go back to my hotel room and ring up Andrew in prison and say, as I said to you, their pissant tentacles don't reach over here. We're only an hour into it, and the judges are already onto them. This is going to be as sweet as a nut.
Luckily enough, Malcolm McCusker applied for an appeal to the High Court, and thank God all 5 High Court judges went like that. They heard the exact same evidence that these 3 judges here heard, and all 5 unanimously went completely the other way and said, this man needs a retrial, we are quashing his conviction. And it was then up to the DPP, of course, to decide whether to go ahead with a retrial or not. The DPP came out and said, well, you know, we really don't have any evidence against this guy other than the word of the police and the notes that the police made in interviews that were not recorded. And because of that, we won't contest the retrial. So we're going to set Andrew free. But Andrew remains the prime suspect. Talk about a stab in the back.
I never ever believed from day one that I would spend the rest of my life in prison. I had done nothing wrong. I knew that as long as I stayed true to myself and stuck to my guns, that the truth would come out. The truth would come out and I would be exonerated and released. I had already gone through in my mind how I was going to leave the prison. I vowed in my mind that I would not look over my shoulder. I would not look back. I was determined to stay forward, keep my head forward, keep going forward. And I did that.
No structure. No one to resist. No regime to be maintained. No appeal to focus on. Suddenly, free air freedom. What would happen to such a mind? It's like a scuba diver coming to the surface. If you come too fast, you'll explode. The nitrogen will just get into your bones through those fibrous, pory bits around your knees and your joints, and you'll get the bends and you'll cripple and you'll die. I said, Andrew, you've got to come to the surface very slowly, very slowly.
To take 12 years of a man's life away from him, I mean, we get one shot at life. To have 12 years of it just taken away from you like that, through no fault of yours, is just appalling. And we sort of think that the justice system in countries like Indonesia is bad and, you know, some of the African countries, but what they did to Andrew was just, you know, was on a par with anything I've come across in some of these other countries, so it's just appalling what they did to him. So we have to pay to make it right.
I hate the people for their laziness. I hate the people for their injustices. And I hate the people for the abuse that they visited on the Western Australian legal system and the damage that it did to its reputation, which held up as a laughing stock around Australia. Anyway, Andrew doesn't carry that bitterness. I've got to learn from him.
I hope that I'm able to change things within the police and the justice system so that this sort of thing is less. I don't believe that there is such thing as an infallible justice system or an infallible police service, because you're dealing with people and people make mistakes and people can be bad, as I just said. Lawyers and police and judges have not only a professional duty but a moral and ethical duty to us, the public, and that's a very, very difficult job and position to be in. So I have a great and profound respect for the police service and the justice system and lawyers as a whole, but it's the people factor that always throws a wrench into the system.
We tend to be brought up to trust the police, to trust or at least assume that the justice system is just. I have to say that what I learnt through the whole go to woe issues in Andrew's case, that I've learnt that certainly the justice system might carry out the law, but I have considerable doubts as to whether it's entirely just.
We as human beings are all a product of the times we live in. And the experiences that Andrew went through, he's a product of. We grow through our suffering. We don't grow through our parties. We grow through the experience of watching our father die. So what I'm trying to say is it's through this suffering that often we grow into the better person. And I'm sure that through Andrew's suffering, he grew into something bigger and better.
I never look at the experience I suffered as a negative thing. It made me a better person for it, made me a stronger man, and taught me the value of truth, the meaning of justice, and it also taught me that you really can rely on human beings to come through when things are very tough.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Mallard, the justice here's so poor. A killer gets off freely as they slam your boy's cell door. And your family writhed in torment at a trial that wasn't fair. And our entire legal system didn't care that an innocent man was spending 12
It took me 11 and a half years to get to this point here, but I have to say it was not just through my own determination to prove my innocence and to come through this a better person. It was with the truth and the integrity of those who supported me. I don't expect to not encounter more troubles, but I certainly will be wiser, and with this strength that I have discovered, I will be better able to cope.
And I'm really sorry, Andrew, for what's been done to you. How they stitched you up for something